I think Caitlin gave you a little brief overview, but why am I talking to you? My background, I have a master's in public policy and a master's in public health. My interest has always been in that connection of health and policy, but I define that very broadly. So your access to health is also related to your access to freedom, your access to being free from collateral consequences, and so much more that relates to Clean Slate. As she said, I'm located here in Colorado, and my firm is called Carrick Strategies. We represent a variety of mission-based clients, almost exclusively nonprofits, everyone from Interfaith Alliance, who was my client for whom I got to work on Clean Slate. We also represent the ACLU of Colorado, lots of healthcare folks, tons of different folks who focus on vulnerable populations, and we're honored to do the work. If you wouldn't mind, I would love to know more about you. Can you put your name and your state in the chat so we can see who's joining us today? And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to move on just so we can make sure we cover everything possible today. All right, so what is our goal here? We are going to try to understand what fiscal notes are. Let's start from the top, right? What they are, why they may become inflated on clean slate bills. We're going to learn some practical strategies that worked here in Colorado and that I really hope are translatable to where you are. And we're, of course, going to talk about some of the limitations, the personalities that play, and how we can maximize this sort of concept of the right messenger, which I'm sure you guys have heard if you've been working in the fun world of politics for any amount of time. Okay, so while you're putting in your name, I would love to just get a sense. When you think about the barriers in your state to clean slate passage, what rises to the top for challenges? Is it your high fiscal notes? Are you guys having major budget issues? Or is it the philosophy of tough on crime? Is it engagement from the business community? Are you having trouble finding the right sponsors? What are the challenges that you're seeing? I would love to get a sense if you're able to share because I want to make sure that we're covering your concerns. So feel free, anyone is brave enough to put it in the chat. High fiscal notes, highway patrol opposition, court opposition. Makes sense. All right. You guys feel free to keep adding what your challenges are, and we can revisit some of those. All right. Okay, so we're going to jump into what are fiscal notes and why do they balloon on our issue? All right, so I'm having issues navigating here. Apologies. Okay. So what are fiscal notes? So as Caitlin said, we're going to use the term fiscal notes here. They might be called budget impacts. They might be called a variety of things in your state. Broadly speaking, fiscal notes are designed to estimate the impact of proposed legislation on state revenue or expenditure. So what that means is basically it's a document that says if this bill was implemented, here's the amount of money the state would have to spend to implement it, or the amount of money the state would receive if it was implemented, right? So money coming in or out. That's what this document tells us. This traditionally is a non-binding decision-making tool for legislators. So as legislators are looking at whether or not they should vote for or against a policy, they can look at a fiscal note that is usually developed by nonpartisan staff, that last point there. And it's essentially a summary document that says here is how it's going to impact each of the state agencies. So whether that's the Department of Public Safety, the courts, the judicial department, AG's office, whoever it might be, here's how it's going to impact each of the state agencies. And so then legislators can use that document to make decisions about whether or not they want the state to fund this particular policy. Okay, so why do they balloon? What happens here? On Clean Slate specifically, what we see is that tech system upgrades can be a real challenge. So, as you know, so much of what we're doing on Clean Slate is really trying to automate the sealing of records so that an individual doesn't have to petition to get their record sealed. If we can create metrics for when a person's record can be sealed, we can streamline the automation, right? That's our goal. And in order to do that, we get stuck in a quagmire of technology. Every state is really different. And what happens is one of the reasons that Clean Slate fiscal notes balloon is because we often are inheriting really old, sometimes called legacy IT systems. So they're these old technology systems that were built in, the 90s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s at this point is old technology. And oftentimes we are asking, for example, the judicial department's technology to talk to technology, a different system that's over in, let's say, the Department of Public Safety or whatever the departments are in your state. And we're asking for these different, very old systems to talk to each other. In this process, I once had a state agency person tell me that essentially what we were asking someone to do is to send a Ferrari down a railroad. That was his explanation of why it was so hard for us to do what we wanted to do. He basically was like, the data and the type of data and the way that you're moving data from this system over here, that's a new system, you're asking it to drive a Ferrari down a railroad. And his point was both are designed to move data, but they are not the same system and they can't talk to each other. And so we were trying to problem solve around that, right? So you just have to keep in mind those tech systems are what they are. Oftentimes, one of the main drivers of additional work is that these agency staff, when they create their fiscal notes, they assume manual work. That is their point of reference. Most of the work that they do in general at their job is manual work. And so when they read the bill text, they don't assume automation. They assume that we want an individual person to one by one by one by one go through and seal every single criminal record. And so that assumption ends up costing a lot of money. Sometimes we see interagency process confusion. So agencies sometimes don't know which entity is being asked to take responsibility for various parts of the process in our bills. And so sometimes we'll even see two agencies that believe they're responsible for the same part of the process, or worse, we'll see two agencies that neither one of them is taking responsibility for a part of the process when we actually do need that to happen. So that confusion can increase fiscal notes. We pretty much always see risk averse cost estimates. So when agencies are estimating how much it's going to cost for them to implement a bill, this is true of all bills, not just Clean Slate, but anytime they're making an estimate, they are going to be very risk averse. One of the worst things that can happen to an agency is for them to say, okay, this will cost us $1 million to implement, and then it turns out to cost $5 million to implement. That is a catastrophe for an agency. So they are very risk averse and they always overestimate so that they don't get in trouble down the line in the implementation process. And then the last one here is misinterpretation of bill language. So sometimes the mid-level bureaucrats who are in charge of creating these fiscal notes, they don't necessarily understand the language of the bill, or they're sort of the bill language itself is not clear. And we ran into that a few times in Colorado. And so we can take ownership of that as well, right? If the language is ambiguous, they have to interpret. And sometimes they're not interpreting in the way that we had intended. Okay. So how much does it cost? How much does it cost to get this done? I wish we knew the answer. I wish we could just tell you it costs X amount of money to implement Clean Slate in every state. Unfortunately, determining the cost of Clean Slate is really difficult. One, because of that state context. So it really varies depending on the existing infrastructure of the state. So the existing technology infrastructure, what do those systems look like? Are they already talking to each other? How old are they, et cetera? And then it also matters what policy that state is able to implement. So some policies are more complicated than others and some are simpler. And so those factors alone, that state context really makes it difficult to create any, continuity of understanding of the cost. And then secondary, using Clean Slate as an avenue to obtain other upgrades or staff. It's just, we don't really have a, a way to get after the budget for how much the upgrades and staff is going to use. And so what happens is what we see sometimes is agencies will use this bill or this process as a means of improving technology broadly speaking. We saw that in Colorado as well, right? They say, "Oh, hey, you guys want to update this system for your specific purpose. While we're at it, let's update this entire system so that we really come into the new era," right? So we see them sort of using this opportunity. So, unfortunately, for all those reasons, we don't necessarily know what the cost is. Um, you know, we once had in Colorado, they told us to get basically the Cadillac version of this to make sure all the systems work together and to build out an entire new system for the state with all of the departments combined would cost upwards of $10 million. That's like the Cadillac thing to build everything from the ground up. And that was several years ago, so it would cost more now. And we didn't need the Cadillac, right? We needed the minimum viable product. We needed it to work. We needed automation to work so that we could actually get records sealed. So that's what we were working toward. Okay. What is the problem with having a big fiscal note? Why do we care? So obviously, you guys have probably run into this. A lack of funding in your state budgets can mean that the fiscal note alone, you could have all of the philosophical alignment, you could have all, political caucuses in your corner, you could have great legislative champions, support of the business community, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have the money to pay for this to get done, that alone can mean the death of your bill in appropriations committee or your finance committee or wherever you end up. So it's really important that we try to make sure that the bill is only responsible for the true costs of implementation, right? And that we're minimizing those real costs as much as possible with clarity in the bill. Also, having a high fiscal note because it can have that impact on the bill's ultimate demise. It means opposition gets leverage, right? So your opposition folks, I saw somebody in the chat put in state patrol or the courts or the district attorneys or whoever else. They can use that high fiscal note and walk around and say, "Hey, do you really want to, hello, legislator, do you really want to pay 6, 8, $10 million so that criminals can have their records sealed?" They use it as leverage, right? And we don't want to give them any more leverage than they already have. So we want to eliminate that as much as possible. And of course, it can just slow momentum. Sometimes when we have these really high fiscal notes, even our best champions, our legislative champions, will start to feel concerned and frustrated that there's sort of no way up the mountain if it's always going to cost this amount of money. So we always want to make sure we're really talking about true costs and not, deflating anybody in the process because this is achievable and we can do this and many states have. And so we got to keep up the momentum. All right, so let's talk about what we did here in Colorado, just as a case study for all of you. All right, so in Colorado, I'm thrilled to tell you that in 2022, we passed the sealing of SB 99, the sealing of criminal records. So it was just like the policies you've been working on in your states. It is an automated record sealing process. So instead of having to petition the courts, we set up some metrics for who qualified and then created an automated process for sealing. I am thrilled to tell you that we had bipartisan sponsors. Senator Dennis Heisey is a Republican in the Senate. Senator Robert Rodriguez is a Democrat in the Senate. And then in the House, we had Representative Carrie Tipper, a Democrat, and Representative Colin Larson, a Republican. So bipartisan in both chambers. And I will just note, additionally, these are not, like the far right or far left of the party. These are moderates in both parties, right? So a moderate Dems and moderate Republicans, which I do believe really helped us. Okay, so what was the problem? What did we run into here in Colorado? Well, we ran into an $8 million brick wall. The initial fiscal note came out and it said, a little under $1 million for the first year of implementation. But this number to the right of it is really what got us. It was going to be $8 million in the second year to get this done, which is very concerning. And frankly, at the time in our government, it was a death knell to our effort. So we had to start working on the fiscal note. And I just want to note, like, the initial fiscal note had this in there, and when you get the fiscal note, it doesn't just have these numbers. It has an explanation of how they got to these numbers, and I just want to read you a quote from this first fiscal note. So it said, for the first sealing list, so this is the list of people that, in our case, it was about 2,000 people that they were going to seal immediately upon passage of the bill. So about 2,000 people get their records sealed. Hooray. And this is how they were going to do it. They said, in fiscal year 22-23 only, expenditures in the Department of Public Safety will increase by 5 million. This includes 4.7 million to hire contract staff to compare the initial list to CBI's records and to conduct any necessary research on intervening convictions. This assumes that each of the 562,000 records takes on average 20 minutes at an estimated contract rate of $25 an hour. So they were going to pay a whole bunch of people, $25 an hour to go one by one through 562,000 records to seal these records. That was how they got to $5 million. So that tells us immediately they are not assuming automation. All right. So that tells us, right? Here's our breakthrough discovery. Okay, oh no, it's going to be $8 million. We learned that language in the bill was actually triggering the department assumption of manual and human review. And obviously, our intent was automation or semi-automation to the degree possible. And adjusting this interpretation and clarifying intent dramatically lowered their projection costs. So we're going to talk through how we did that. So our mitigation steps here, we're going to talk through how to implement these in your state, but just so you get a sense of what we did here in Colorado. We met individually with each agency. So for us, that was the courts, that was public safety, it was the district attorney. They're not an agency, but they have a step in the process in Colorado. So we met with them tons and tons of times. And then we went through and we worked to understand their assumptions line by line. We truly sat down with them and went line by line to understand how they plan to operationalize the language they were reading. So it was in that process that we learned that they were interpreting language that we had written in a way that essentially in their minds required them to do it manually. They really believed that we wanted a human being to sit down and search every spelling of the name Michael. So let's say we're sealing the records of Michael Smith. They thought we wanted somebody to sit down, do every iteration of Michael, Mikey, Mike, and then the misspellings of Michael and make sure and do this really nuanced sweep of everything. So they believed it required manual work. We also brought the departments together to align their processes and reduce finger pointing. A lot of what was happening for us initially is that we were meeting with the departments separately, and every time we hit an issue, they said, well, that's the responsibility of public safety, or that's the responsibility of the courts. And we kept getting kind of stuck in the middle between these departments. It was only when we brought the departments together that they were all in a meeting together and we were able to really hash out who was responsible for what, how the process would actually work. And then it was in that meeting we actually heard somebody say, one of the department staff said to a different department, oh, I guess we could just download that as a spreadsheet and just email it over to you, as opposed to scrubbing all the data so that it can go through this specific system, right? And so it cut down on a ton of labor and a ton of extra steps. And then including the actual coders or the technical experts, sort of the implementation team at each agency department. We'll talk more about how to do this, but it is critically important for understanding how the process is going to work. I can tell you right now that the people at the top of the agency or the sort of lobbyists or legislative liaisons for the agency truly don't know what the implementation looks like on the ground for the people who do this work. So we have to be talking to those folks. So we'll talk more about how to get there and what to do. We also engaged Code for America and CSI. Hooray for both of those incredible organizations. Our host today, of course, they truly were instrumental in making sure that we could understand all of these technology challenges. You know, us as advocates in the state, probably like many of you, we are not technical experts, but they really helped train us on these issues. They came into meetings as requested to make sure that we were asking the right questions, help us sort of with process mapping and that sort of thing, to make sure that we were getting after the right technology challenges. They are, I will say, you know, this is a delicate balance because agency personnel can get a little jumpy about their being stepped on from a technology perspective. Like if you have, you know, departmental coders on a call, and then you bring other outside coders to question them, that can always be a bit of a challenge. I will just tell you, CSI and Code for America, they're very good at this. They're very gentle in how they do it. And so they're very good about not offending state staff. But you just want to be careful kind of when and how you engage their services. So we make sure that we're maintaining really good relationships with our state agencies because it's critical for this process. And then we met with the fiscal analyst. Okay, so we talked earlier how in most states and in Colorado, there's this nonpartisan staff that creates these fiscal notes, right? And so that person is available to you. You can reach out to them. They are nonpartisan staff, meaning they don't, you know, work for the governor in the same way that the departments do. So they take all the information from the departments, create a fiscal note, so you can meet with them, and we'll talk more about that. But that was a critical element of our process here to make sure that they understood how we interpreted the process for the bill. It's really important that those folks, because they're nonpartisan, they don't want to feel lobbied, right? So you want to be very data forward, process forward. These are not the folks who are going to be moved by our sort of anecdotal or philosophical arguments. Their job is not to determine whether or not the policy is a good policy. Their job is to determine whether how much it's going to cost. So you want to exclusively be talking about those things. CSI can really, really help make sure you are trained to focus on those things, and help the analysts understand our perspective about costs. And then, of course, we really used our legislative sponsors to inspire cooperation amongst all these agencies and sort of keep everybody at the table for this process. So having really good champions on your bill is critical. What did all of that get us? Well, I am so thrilled to tell you that we actually were able to reduce the fiscal note from over $8 million in year two down to 1.4 million in year two. You'll also notice that that $774,000 number went down, and that the fiscal year the following year, that third year out, went down from, I think it was previously 1.4 million, it went down to 396,000. So we decreased all these numbers dramatically, but the most important one is we got that over 8 million down to 1.4. And that is for all of the reasons and all of these steps that we implemented, but the biggest numbers were really helping the agency staff to understand how automation could work in this process, and also changing language in the bill to ensure that they could interpret it to be automated. All right. All right. So in the chat, really briefly, I'm wondering if you guys would just tell me, do you have um, you know, have you ever talked to agency staff? I mean, have you talked to them? What have you found out? Did they, were they planning to implement it in the way that you intended, or did you get any aha moments? All right, you guys can think about that. I will watch the chat. I'm interested to sort of just know if you guys, you know, have attempted this, you know, discussion with agency staff, because I do think it's going to be really key. They never get to actual numbers. In Massachusetts, I'm wondering, like, do you get the numbers through your fiscal note? Don't mean to put you on the
Yeah,
spot.
no, that's okay. No, and that's where we're at right now is that we're just can't get enough, details or information to trying to make estimates based on, other states. It feels like we're chasing shadows.
Totally. And is your bill introduced?
Yes, yeah, we have, yeah, there's a version in our Senate Ways and Means Committee
Okay.
and a House version in the Judiciary Committee. And folks are very interested in the costs of implementation. We really want to get it to them, and we're just really struggling with that.
And they're asking, you don't have a nonpartisan process who comes up with implementation costs. They're sort of asking advocates for that.
Correct. Yeah, we don't
Okay,
have like a CBO or anything
got
like,
it.
or, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, here in Colorado, we run into that before the fiscal note process. I would say there's pros and cons to having this nonpartisan fiscal note process, right? Like in some respects, there's something nice about being asked yourself how much your own bill is going to cost. Um, but, you know, so there are times when it's detrimental to us. But on the other hand, it is nice to sort of have it be this nonpartisan entity's job to look at these costs. But we run into this prior to the fiscal note being released. So when we're doing stakeholder work on bills before they are introduced. And we usually use estimates from other states. I'm sure you're doing that. But we usually try to collate as much as we can from other states and say, hey, here's what we know. We can't know with certainty. But this is what we've found in other states. And many other states have these fiscal notes, and we usually pull all those fiscal notes and kind of pull them into kind of a white paper. I'm guessing you are working on that.
Yeah, and if anybody's willing to share fiscal notes of past states, and then we'll add a big inflationary
Yeah,
increase and go from there.
yeah. That makes sense. Well, you should certainly use the updated fiscal note from Colorado. I do think it would be helpful. And I know CSI can share that with you, or I'm happy to as well. All right. Keep adding stuff in the chat, and I know our CSI team is in there answering questions as well. And please feel free to raise anything up for me if you want me to speak to it, Caitlin. All right, so let's talk through these strategies in a little bit more detail. All right, so here we go. Agency by agency engagement. Okay, so how do we do this? All right, so this can be so ask for specific cost breakdowns and workflow assumptions. I already heard you guys, a couple of you are saying, like, we're chasing shadows. I completely get it. I have been there. And what I would tell you in those situations, if your agencies are truly not playing ball, I would have your legislators, your bill champions, invite them have them, I would ghostwrite an email, have it sent from your legislators, and have your legislators send emails to the departments and say, I am asking you for X, and be very specific. I'm asking you for how much it would cost to implement, this piece of the bill or this process. How much would it cost? How are you planning to implement this workflow aspect, right? Like really break it down. And if they say, we don't know, I think you have the legislator ask for a meeting with the staff who will operationalize the bill if it passes. Bottom line is, if the bill becomes law, they are responsible for implementing it. So they are going to have to figure out costs. Granted, they are going to start guessing because many of you know that a lot of the way that they end up doing this is they basically send out the changes or the technology changes. They send them out for RFP, which means a request for proposals to vendors, which are basically companies that are going to bid on implementing this. So, like coding companies or other third party vendors who will come in and the state will pay them to build out this technology. So, until they do that RFP process and they get bids back from vendors, it's true that they may not know specifically how much it's going to cost, but they can put together some estimates. As we discussed, those estimates are going to be high, but at least you'll have some estimates. Okay. Um, Second, push for clarity on what are one-time costs versus ongoing costs. All right, so obviously, more automation means early costs because you have to build the technology. Less automation means more long-term costs because they have to hire FTE and train FTE. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, but our goal is to move as much as possible toward automation so we don't have to continue hiring a ton of staff. And you might hear me say FTE, that means full-time equivalent employee. That is essentially means like, an FTE is one human person working at the state. So you really want to get them to kind of pull apart what are these one-time costs versus ongoing costs. Typically, one-time costs are going to be tech upgrades, ongoing costs are going to be FTE, human hiring. Request written process maps. I understand they're going to be resistant to this, but they're going to have to write out these process maps. And what actually we found helpful in Colorado, you can take a stab at this, right? Like you can write and CFI, CSI, or CFA and CSI can help you with this. So they can work with you to try to come up with a process map to give the departments so that they have something to react to. You know how it's always easier sometimes to edit something than it is to come up with it whole cloth? If you put together a process map for how you envision the bill working, and give it to them and say, hey, this is what we're envisioning. Can you help us understand how it would work on the ground when you operationalize it? That way you can start to learn a bit more as you walk through the process with them. And they can say, hey, that's not how this works. Or no, in order for that to happen, we have to send it through this thing over here. So that process map can really, really help get everybody on the same page. And then understanding which pieces are policy driven versus tech driven. So sometimes, for example, you might find out that a process in your bill. So for most of you, at least in Colorado, there's so many steps in the sealing process, that it seems like there's like 8 steps to get something sealed, right? In our state, the DAs have to review it and it has to go from judicial over to public safety, and there's all these different steps. We, in some respects, assigned at the beginning almost random timelines. We basically said, okay, this department has 15 days upon receiving this data to get it over to the next step. And what we found out in this process is instead of 15 days, if we made that 25 days, that it actually changed the fiscal note because it allowed them to send something in a different format than it would in the 15-day timeline. I think one of the things was like a 30-day timeline allowed them to do, they already collated a monthly report. And the way we had it, it was a 15-day timeline. And they said, well, we have to generate this whole separate report and it has to go through this whole vetting process, et cetera, et cetera. And well, we said, well, what timeline would mean you don't have to do that? And they said, oh, well, we do that report every 30 days. And we said, oh, okay, great. How about 30 days? And we were able to just change that in the policy itself, right? So that is a policy driven fiscal note change versus a tech fiscal note, right? So some of the technology you just simply have to pay for. You have to pay for some of those upgrades and changes, but some of the way we write the policy can really lessen those costs and not have a meaningful impact on your goal. All right, and you have to be pretty literal with your agency staff. You often have to ask very specifically. They don't want to give you language. Like they never at any point told us, "Hey, we suggest changing this to 30 days. That would help your goal." We had to that one conversation probably took us 2 hours, right? Like we finally had to chip away and finally we understood and we finally asked the right question to get to the correct answer. And so sometimes you have to truly ask, would this cost change if we alter X, right? So you want to be very specific with how you ask questions so you get to the right answers. All right, strategy number 2, convening these multi-agency meetings. I will tell you right now, they don't like doing this. The agencies live in their silos. They don't want to talk to the other departments, and they are not used to doing it. They get very uncomfortable when you ask them to do it, and it's so important to do. So this is another area where you might have to ask your champions to step in to engage here. So basically needed this to start eliminating some of those interagency contradictions. I told you earlier about how we learned that we were essentially being double charged because both judicial and the public safety departments thought they were responsible for the same part of the process. So, right there, we discovered, oh, we're being double charged for this process, and getting them on one phone call, one Zoom meeting allowed us to understand that, right? So suddenly they were both like, oh, well, we don't both have to do that part. And we were able to eliminate some of that cost. There were other parts where both departments said, oh, I didn't know we were responsible for that. And so had the bill been implemented, neither of them would have picked up that piece of the process. That's equally terrifying, if not more so. So getting them onto the same call is really critical. And this is where that process map again comes into play. If you have one shared process map, because what you'll see is that, your various departments are going to have their own little process map. They think within the confines of their department. So they're going to say, here's my little process map at the Department of Public Safety. Here's my little process map at the courts, right? And so getting a shared process map to see what implementation looks like from start to finish and where data goes from judicial to public safety and back again is really, really helpful to make sure everybody's on the same page with the flow. So I strongly recommend that. Bringing that to this shared meeting can really help them understand how they're going to have to work together to get this done. Um, Ensuring everyone agrees on automation versus human review. So this is just another part of that conversation where we had to be really specific in our policy where we were hoping for and expecting automation. And we certainly got some pushback. I saw someone in the chat saying they just don't believe it's possible. And I don't even know what to tell you because I completely empathize with that. And we were very lucky to have some, I think, very thoughtful coders come to the meetings. I think that was a key part of it is that we were able to really, really push to make sure that we didn't have, the upper agency staff or the lobbyists or ledge liaisons. We actually had the people implementing the policy. And just so you know, it's often not the same person who is kind of the programmatic lead at the department and then the technology lead. Those two people have to work together to get this done. But we found out, we finally got to a point in the meetings where we got the program lead there, but she still did not know how the technology would exactly work. And so we ended up having to get the literal coder in the room to talk to us about how this would work, right? And that was very helpful to us. So sometimes you just have to keep pushing and if you reach an impasse, having your legislator say, who would know the answer to this question? Who in the department is responsible for the answer to this question? Because you just have to keep gently pushing. Loving kindness toward these agencies. They're going through a lot. Um, and then, to that point, keeping sponsors present for that accountability. You know, we're asking a lot of these agencies. As I said, they don't typically work across departments. This is major tech changes. It's a whole new way of thinking for them. So we're asking a lot. It's a high pressure situation. They don't typically the bureaucrats stay way out of the politics. They want to be as far away from the politics as possible. And so a lot of times when we're meeting with the agencies, we say things to start the meeting like, we understand your agency does not have a position on this bill. Or you can even say, we understand your agency is opposed to this bill. We are not asking you to take a different position. We are not asking you to represent any position from your agency. We are asking for help understanding your processes, right? So, because they feel very anxious that they're going to say something wrong and get in trouble with the governor, because that's who their boss is, right? So we just have to be very kind of kid gloves with our agency partners. All right, strategy three, including technical practitioners. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit, but coders can identify simpler, cheaper solutions that are more accurate. They can explain what's creating the inflated IT hours and cost estimates. And so there were times in our Colorado process where we realized like, the coder said, "Oh, in order for us to do that, we have to add this like really nuanced code for this system to talk to that system." And this was so many years ago now, but there was one piece of it where we realized, like, actually, that's not that important to us. Or there was a piece of it that we realized was probably not going to be politically palatable, meaning we couldn't pass it from a political philosophical perspective. And then we found out that eliminating it would get rid of, $2 million of the fiscal note. We went to our champions, we went to our coalition and said, is this worth it? Do we want to sacrifice this in order to move the policy forward and get these records sealed, right? So thinking through what is necessary and what is possible. And then encouraging agencies to bring their IT leads, so not just their legislative liaisons, if you have those there. You just have to keep reiterating that you want the implementation folks there. There may be resistance. Again, your legislative team should be able to help, or your lobbyists, or if your governor's office is with you, they can certainly help. Find who can apply some thoughtful pressure to your departmental staff. And that certainly can be you. You can just be tenacious. You can just continue to ask for meetings and say, we really want to get at this question. Can you help us understand and ask for who can answer this question about your process, right? I frankly did that so many times with their legislative liaison, which is essentially the lobbyist for the department. I asked him so many nuanced questions that he finally just gave up and let us meet with the implementation people. So sometimes it's just simply being that tenacious. Okay, strategy number 4, using our resources. So we've already discussed CSI, CFA and CSI bring national credibility, and they really helpfully can bring real world implementation experience from other states. So sometimes it can really, really help to be able to walk in and say, hey, we are not inventing the wheel here. Nobody needs to panic. We've done this in other states. It's gone well. Let's just talk it through, right? So sometimes it can bring the temperature down to say, hey, we've implemented this in this many states. Here's a state that looks similar to yours from an infrastructure perspective, or here's a state where the policy looks a bit like yours. Here are the challenges we ran into. What are your challenges? Maybe they're similar, maybe they're different. So they can really, really be a huge support. So always, always reach out to them in this process. We certainly use their expertise here in Colorado. And they can help agencies scope practical automation. So just figuring out sort of where in this process automation is even possible, where we've seen it done before. Sometimes these, you know, agencies and bureaucratic entities don't even have a sense of what's possible because they haven't done it before. So it can really help for them to hear from experts. What we can create to make this possible for you. And then support with, they can, provide a lot of technological consulting, support with process mapping, and really, really importantly, they can help train you on the ground to become this data-oriented, technology-led spokesperson, right? So if, like me, you did not walk in knowing anything about all these systems, and already it's been several years and I've forgotten all of it. But if you did not walk in knowing anything about these systems where the different records are kept and which database has to talk to which and how they all have to interact, et cetera, et cetera, that's the type of thing where CSI can come in and really support you in becoming a powerful spokesperson on these issues, and they can make sure that you feel ready to have these discussions. So I don't ever want you to feel like you're in it alone. All right, working with the fiscal analyst. I am heartbroken to hear that some of you guys don't in other states have these fiscal analysts. I know some states do have this, so I will talk about it as an option. But working with the fiscal analyst, so here in Colorado, and I know in a variety of other states, there are these nonprofit entities where they employ fiscal analysts who are nonpartisan, who take all of the fiscal the fiscal notes from each state department. They analyze them to say, are these appropriate? Do they seem reasonable? Or are they rooted in a partisan response, right? So let's say if the governor hates your bill and the state departments work for the governor, theoretically, they could artificially inflate those costs. They're not supposed to be clear, they're not supposed to, but they could, and candidly, they do sometimes. So the goal of the fiscal analyst is to look through those costs, apply pressure, push back on the departments for costs that seem out of whack, and then create that summary document, the fiscal analysis. And they respond to questions about the fiscal impact, et cetera. And in states where this exists, they are a public resource. So they are available to you and they can be hugely, hugely beneficial. So they can provide memos explaining alternative assumptions. So, if you said, if a legislator reached out to a fiscal analyst and said, "Hey, we want to, do this in a different way. We want to implement this in a different way. Can you create a cost estimate for that?" Sometimes they are able and willing to do that. And like I said, they can pressure agencies as opposed to just taking their flat estimates. A really good analyst will push back and say, "You said you need to hire 100 people to do this manually. Can we talk through, tell me how you got to your assumption of 20 minutes per record ceiling." Obviously, we want automation and not manual anyway, but that's the type of thing where they would heavily push back. They would flag double counting and process inefficiencies. So when we talked earlier about, two departments were saying, "Oh, we're both responsible for this piece of the process." Ideally, the analyst would flag that and eliminate that challenge. Um, and then they would consider, you can consider the effective date of a policy. So, really, this is sort of nuanced, but I think in pretty much every state, your effective date determines how much your bill is going to cost, particularly in the first year. So in Colorado, depending on, this is super in the weeds, but bottom line is if you say your bill is going to start in October or start in July, you can push the date out a little bit to reduce those initial implementation costs because they prorate it for that first year. And sometimes the departments really appreciate that because they want sort of a runway to get everything ready before the go live happens. So it's just one tool to think about, especially as you're negotiating with the departments, thinking about, okay, if we push out the effective date, not only will the departments be a little relieved because they're overwhelmed by this, but also we can reduce our initial fiscal note. All right. Okay, strategy 6, messenger strategy and personality dynamics. I think many of you know this, but here we are in the world of politics, so it has to be said. Everything is relational, right? So nothing is done in a total vacuum. I will say fiscal notes seem like they are just written in stone and they are dropped on your head and they are not anything that we can engage with. I will tell you, just like anything in politics, it is heavily relational. So it is still helpful to think about who is the best messenger for each government actor. So as you are meeting with these various departments, so let's say, you're meeting with the courts or you're meeting with the Department of Public Safety. Not always, but sometimes those folks can lean to the right on our political spectrum. So sometimes it's valuable to have, ideally, if you have it, Republican legislators do the outreach to those departments. Sometimes that can inspire more engagement from them, right? Or if you have the governor's office, that's the dream scenario. If you have the governor with you, they can really help direct the departments to being as solution oriented as possible. Or thinking about, do you have Code for America or CSI or another entity who can help you with the technology questions? And thinking about how do you arm yourself with the knowledge and skills by engaging with CSI and others to have these conversations yourself. That is really possible. I will tell you, most of what we did in this process was ask questions. You do not have to be an expert to ask questions. You listen to them, you listen to their process, you listen to how they're going to get it done, and you just start asking more and more questions to really, really understand and think about what are the ways that we can start to solve these challenges, right? So most of it is about asking the right questions, which all of you can do. And then we need to just say, right, we have to accept the reality that implementing Clean Slate costs money. It just does. This is a meaningful shift in how this is done in the United States. It is an incredible, incredible policy, and I'm so excited that all of you have committed your time and energy to this work. And it costs money, and it costs money to do it right. So you will probably have a fiscal note. So we do need to accept that reality. We also need to accept that there are going to be personalities that are very resistant to change. And I will just tell you, often in my experience, bureaucrats can fall into this category. They have their system for how they do something, they know how to do it, they're very comfortable in how they do it, and they don't want it to change. So sometimes they can be a point of resistance, right? Some agencies default to worst case assumptions, right? So if there's a range of, let's say, records that are going to be sealed, they will say, we are assuming that it's going to be the top of the range, and we have to prepare as though it's going to be the top of the range. So they're always going to assume the most work and the most cost, right? That's part of their risk aversion. And then sometimes mitigation is limited despite our best efforts, right? Like there are just times when the IT system is simply too old and it does need to be updated, and it does cost that amount of money. It's just part of it. And so I don't want to give you the impression that like you can implement a variety of steps and eliminate your fiscal note or get it down to nothing. I want you to know that it's okay that this is going to cost money. We are going to have to sell this policy with the knowledge that it costs money, and that's okay. We need to sell our states on the fact that we should invest money this way because there's value in removing these collateral consequences to help folks get back to school, get back to work, and make sure that they can be, that all of us can be productive citizens in our most exponential way, right? So we can sell that story even with cost. Our goal here is to just make sure the fiscal note has real costs and not inflated costs. All right. Strategy number 7, bipartisanship. Okay. Clean slate, and frankly, I would argue most bills, but particularly criminal justice reform, I believe, is strongest when bipartisan. And I believe this regardless of the politics of your state. That might sound wild. So here in Colorado, as you know, I told you earlier, we had bipartisan legislators on our bill. Since that time, our legislature has shifted, right? So we had, I think in 2022, we still had a Republican Senate and a Democrat House. We now have Democrats everywhere, Democrat governor, Democrat majority in the House, Democrat majority in the Senate. Even now, if I was starting today to pass this policy, I would make sure it was bipartisan, even though there's like 19 out of 65 Republicans in the House. I would still work as hard as humanly possible to make sure there are Republicans on this bill, as well as Democrats, of course. And as I discussed, there is value to that from a variety of perspectives, applying pressure to reluctant agencies. Something about bipartisanship calms them because they know that their boss could be Democrat now, but might be Republican later, or vice versa, right? So they want to make sure that this is a bipartisan thing that can help with their engagement. It can sway appropriations committees, right? So you're going to have Republicans and Democrats on each committee. If you can get both R's and D's on your bill, then that is going to really, really help you with your approps committee, which is critical because, as we said, no matter your best efforts, you are almost certainly going to have a fiscal note of some kind. So you're gonna want those votes, and getting both sides will help. And of course, neutralizing opposition concerns. I'm probably not telling any of you guys anything you don't know, but it really, really helps, particularly in the criminal justice space, to have both parties present. Also, just broadly speaking, with criminal justice reform, I think we have a pendulum challenge, right? Where, things swing one direction and then they swing back the other direction. And several years ago, we were sort of in a, kind of anti-carceral mindset. It has now, I think, swung more to sort of a public safety mindset. And in order to minimize the impact of those philosophical swings nationally and in the state, when policies are bipartisan, it really helps to not put them in the crosshairs during those swings. So even though we've swung back to this sort of public safety mindset, nobody here in Colorado is talking about how to roll back anything related to record sealing. So it's really important for all those reasons. Okay, really just quickly, artificial intelligence is just kind of on the top of everybody's mind. We can't spend a lot of time here because, quite frankly, my recommendation would be to steer clear on artificial intelligence for now. There may come a time in the future, which, given how fast things progress, that could be in a few years, but when AI may eventually be able to support functions in this record sealing process. We are not there yet, to my knowledge. No state has gone down this road, and I tell you to steer clear of it because I this is sort of the third rail for a lot of folks. People get really jumpy about artificial intelligence, I think appropriately so, and I think agencies will be resistant. So I would, if it comes up in your conversations in the state, I think you just say we are not. Our intention is not to go down the pathway of artificial intelligence. We want automation, which is separate from artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to touch on that to say it may come up, and I think our recommendation is to avoid that for now. All right, so I would love to hear from you, and I want to do a quick time check. What I've tried to pull back the curtain a little bit, tried to kind of ground us in what this process looks like. I know it's not the same in every state, and I know it's cumbersome. I would love to hear from you guys. What's going on in your head? How are you feeling about this? Do you feel better positioned? What remains? All right. Yeah, several of you.
I think if you have something to say, please feel free to come off mute.
Yeah.
I just think it's just fascinating. It's almost like
You muted yourself.
We lost you, Marlene.
how to fend off challenges, how to, just the emphasis that you're putting on how scared they might be and recognizing that and basically trying to reduce the tension. I think that was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you for underscoring that because I think it's lost often, right? Like I think sometimes we assume resistance is maybe philosophical or, comes from some other place. I will say, you may have very meaningful philosophical policy resistance from a variety of opposition. In my experience, the departments and bureaucrats are not coming from that space. They are truly confused about what you're asking of them. They don't understand the bill language. They don't even know what you mean by automation. They are just, they don't know. And so it actually was very helpful for us we spent a lot of time sitting down with them or virtually sitting down with them and walking through the process and understanding. Like a lot of it was just, Martha, tell me about your work. How does it work when you do this, right? And she could share, like, here's the process I go through now, and really trying to break down those walls of our understanding and how it works for them. And then we could kind of create these process maps. So you're right, that's a huge part of it. And I will just say, if you get tension and resistance from agency staff, of course, we talked about best messenger and your legislative champions. There's also something to be said for just like taking a step back and saying, we truly want to understand, right? And we are not trying to force you into anything. We want to make sure this process is working for everybody involved. We don't want to hand you a bunch of extra work, right? So trying to align yourself with them, I think, can be really helpful. Sonia is asking about fiscal notes. researched. Caitlin, I think maybe you guys might have some of those.
We
Um,
do. I can jump in there.
Go ahead.
I'll put two documents in the chat. I would just I'll put the fiscal note from Colorado there. And here's a document also that explains the actual costs and has the fiscal notes from Pennsylvania. I will just caution, however, that like Emma was saying, no state no state processes and implementation work is going to be the same as another state. All states have different systems, their policies are different. And so I would really, really caution you not to use these as if they can be just copy pasted into another state. I would say also that Colorado and Pennsylvania are going to be what I would say is the low end. So, insofar as these things are helpful to you to say that, this is what it was estimated in other states, I think that they could be useful. We do have fiscal notes from other states. There are some states where the actual costs and the fiscal notes were definitely higher than this. So I'm sharing those two documents for now. We do have others. If feel free to reach out to me or one of your campaign strategists if you have a question about a specific state, but putting those in for now.
Richard, yeah, I think they are planning to send out the presentation and a short paper detailing some of these steps as well. What do we mean by agency staff? Please note some agencies focus on is clearly on clean, while some in Montana have concerns in areas of confined citizens. So what I mean by agencies is state departments, and thank you for asking because it's not always clear. So each state has the governor's office, and then below that, there's usually 15 to 25 different state departments. And so sometimes they're called state departments or state agencies, and I was probably just saying agencies. So state departments, so that's like, it's the Department of Education or the Department of Medicaid or the Department of Human Services. The courts have their own department typically. Sometimes there's a Department of Public Safety. So there's all these different departments, and essentially we're asking in most states for Clean Slate, we're asking a few of these departments to work together in order to seal records because these tasks, some of the tasks exist in different places. The records are kept in a variety of different places. Sometimes they're kept exclusively at the courts. Sometimes they're kept elsewhere. And so usually it requires some collaboration across these different departments or agencies. Oh, I should have scrolled down. People are answering before me. Caitlin or Katie or anybody, is there anything on here you want me to speak to? You guys have been doing a great job in the chat.
I think we've been responding to things. I'm happy for anyone to jump in with any additional questions. Otherwise, I might jump in and
Yeah.
say a few words if that's all right, Emma.
Please do.
Yes, Emma, thank you so much for all of those those great principles and guidance. I just want to take a minute to say that I think what Emma is saying is not only helpful for reducing or right-sizing fiscal notes, it is helpful in general as a campaign strategy. It is helpful as a strategy to get you ready for implementation. These same principles and the what Emma is demonstrating is going to be helpful beyond just the purposes of fiscal notes. So I think I just want to identify a couple things that I'm really hearing from Emma. One is that just the extent to which she was willing to dig into the policy, dig into the processes, ask questions, really figure these things out, go line by line through the policy and understand processes, the details of processes in order to get to the bottom of problems. How she approached building relationships with these agencies and having influence over these agencies as like a major part of the campaign strategy, really thinking about these things strategically and thinking about these things as being really important. And so I think all of those things are going to help you get your bill passed. And they also help you set you up for implementation to begin right after passage successfully. I think one of the things that, in my experience, agencies don't always get spoken to, right? So oftentimes they get ignored during a campaign process. They're actually pretty used to that and they get a little salty about it, right? So they really don't love a legislator assuming what their process is going to be, assuming that something is as easy as pushing a button, and telling them to do something that in reality is actually quite difficult to do. And so the actual you taking your time to meet with them and having empathy for the fact that they actually have to do the work, and caring about their concerns, just doing that, being willing to spend the time actually is effective. That actually will get you somewhere, with getting them at least to neutral, if not supportive of your bill, and showing interest in their process and saying, like Emma said, like, we want this to work for you. Those things will go a long way. The other thing that this will do, the kinds of work that Emma's talking about, is it will help create a understanding of the actual process of Clean Slate. As Emma's saying, it is very different than their current processes, and it is hard for them to frankly imagine, right? So, and that is a lot of the work that we want to do. We want them to be able to imagine a different system. And so by spending time with them, you're going to be able to get there. And as Emma was saying, is a really, really good point about cross-agency collaboration. We need agencies who don't always work together well, to work together in order to implement Clean Slate. And if you are able to get them in the room together, talk about this process, I can't even tell you, you get such a leg up for when this policy passes, that the agencies are actually ready to start implementing. And I also want to say a few things about how CSI and Code for America can assist and what our role is with all of this. And I think Emma really stated it well, which is that our primary role is to help you be able to do this, right? So we can help prepare you for a meeting. I'll point out one thing that I love that Code for America does, is that they will create a process map, a visual representation of what a Clean Slate process is supposed to look like. They'll even sometimes create a visual representation of what the current petition-based processes look like, so you can kind of do a comparison. And I find that those maps are so helpful for you to understand, but also for you to be able to communicate to the agencies about, hey, this is our vision for the future. This is how we're intending for this to work. And so that's just one example, but also just, training and coaching and sitting with you and making sure you're ready for that. And sometimes Code for America or CSI even could be the right messenger for a situation, but not always. I mean, there are certain situations where we could be the right messenger, and we're willing to do that. But I just want to say that the primary thing that we really want to be doing is helping you be the advocate. Yeah, and sorry, I'll just say a couple more things and then I'll open it up again. A couple other things that we can do is Emma was saying, I think at one point was talking about how sometimes policies can be easier or more complicated to implement. One of the things we can do is kind of analyze the policy and see if there's anything that can be changed or modified that would make the policy simpler and therefore cheaper to implement. So that's something we can do. Another thing that Emma didn't mention that I just want to say briefly is that there are federal grants that are available to both the repository. So in most states, that's the state police, but sometimes it's a different agency. The state records repository and the courts can apply for federal grants to improve their systems. And one of the areas right now for the grant money that was just released that the state agencies can use that for is for record clearing improvements. So there is federal money available, at least right now. Hopefully in the future there will continue to be federal money available, but that's really helpful for states that need to do more intensive improvements. Yeah, and so with that, I will pause and we can answer any other questions that come up.
Could you tell us more about how we'd find out in our particular states about getting this money that you just alluded to? That sounds fabulous.
Yeah, totally. We have connections at CSI with folks that can help a state apply for that. So that's maybe a better for an offline conversation, but we're connected to the folks who know all the best stuff. So there's money that was just released. You have to apply for it very, very soon. So it's probably not the best for states that are currently in the campaign phase. I don't know if the state agencies would be ready, but Pauline, if you want to have a conversation with them about the money that was just released, I'm happy to do that. But there's new money released all the time. Hopefully, fingers crossed, it will continue. But I mean, even in the current state of the federal government, they just released money. So that gives you some idea of the fact that this money, it's for law enforcement agencies and they're primarily and their systems, and so they're still continuing to make that available.
Lauren asked in the chat about timelines for these processes. So obviously earlier is better, but I think there are a ton of challenges with timing. Certainly, they don't want to create fiscal notes before a bill's filed, sometimes later. And if you get an inflated fiscal note, getting them together in time. Yeah, great question. So this is again a challenge because every state is so different. I know some states even have like a 30-day legislative session, or in Colorado we have 120 days. So even here it is a sprint. Our process here is such that once a bill draft is approved by the sponsors, it can be released to the departments for their fiscal analysis. So if you can get that process done early and say, this is what the bill is going to be, they can release that to the departments to get you a fiscal note earlier in the process. But frankly, for our bill, we didn't have a fiscal note until we were in session. And we basically kept pushing our hearings back. And we in Colorado, if your bill has a fiscal note, you can't pass it until your state budget has passed anyway. So we have to go after the state budget has passes. So we had maybe two and a half months to work with the departments to try to figure out what amendments were needed and what interpretations needed to change for them to understand. So, you're right. The timing is really challenging. I think it's just beginning those conversations the moment you possibly can. You have to do your own political analysis about whether or not you can begin those conversations earlier than the bill release. I wouldn't want to comment on that without knowing your political circumstances. We make those decisions sort of on a case-by-case basis here due to the internal politics. But sorry, I think my response would be as soon as possible, and then just be relentless, just kind of like, a bird in the ear type of chirping to get everybody there. Katie's putting federal funding sources. Curious if you have any thoughts about trying to get the policy change in the annual budget versus running a standalone bill and how that choice can help navigate fiscal hurdles. That is a great question. And we thought about that a lot here in Colorado. I would say if you can get it into your annual budget or biannual budget, however your state does it, do that. Absolutely do that. Building it into the structure of the budget is always going to be easier than going into sort of, what you could call the Hunger Games of trying to get money from the small pot of money that they give the legislature to play with each year. That's typically how it works, right? So they build out the state budget and they say, okay, legislature, for this year to pass your bills, we'll give you this tiny amount of money. So much easier to be built into the larger budget instead of fighting over the scraps of money over here. Unfortunately, usually what that requires in most states it's usually unanimous, or at least majority vote on your budget committee. And you may find challenges. A lot of budget committees are resistant to passing bills that are more policy oriented than budget oriented. And I think they would have a good case that this is more of a philosophical policy bill than purely a budget analysis bill or a budget change bill. So you might get some resistance on process there. But I would argue if you can get it in there, get it in there. Um, I just wanted to here's a quick rapid review. You will get these slides. This recording will be available. There's a short issue brief that digs into these issues more. But I wanted you to just, have a sense of the tenants here. Obviously, we need clear bill language, making sure we're only paying for what we have to, getting the right people in the room, aligning the agencies with this process mapping thing is so, so helpful. If you have the option of working with your fiscal analyst, that is a huge, huge benefit. Thoughts and prayers to those of you who don't have that process. I like makes my brain hurt. But I believe in you, and I would argue maybe there are some upsides to be able to create your own fiscal analysis. So I think there's opportunity there as well. And then last but certainly not least, bipartisanship, pound the pavement, get your chambers involved, whatever you have to do to really, really try to lock in bipartisan sponsors. And what I want more than anything is for all of you to walk away knowing that this is not a process that is outside of your wheelhouse, that it is not, something that's outside your scope. All of you have the capacity to engage in this process, and I hope that you do. And I'm, happy to be a resource, and I know CSI is excited and energized to work with all of you on this. And I cannot wait until we've passed this across the nation. And with all of the people on this call, I know that we can. The fact that you guys all just sat through an hour and a half of talking about fiscal notes suggests to me that you are committed to getting this done. So thank you so much for your time and for your energy. And I'm really grateful for all of you. Keep up the good work.
Emma, thank you so much. Let's show some love to Emma in the chat. Thank you for this presentation. I think people feel much better prepared heading into legislative session. We are going to ask you all to fill out a very brief evaluation. This helps us know what to do next for our capacity building training series, helps us know if today resonated with you, what we could have done better. And so if folks can go ahead and click into this evaluation for us, that would be super helpful. I also want to thank Katie for chiming in with your experience, Katie, in navigating these policies and implementing them. And we really appreciate that you all stuck with us for this hour and a half. So we'll leave this meeting open while folks finish filling out the evaluation, and we'll see you at our next capacity building training. Thanks, everyone. All right. Thanks, everyone. From here, we're going to go ahead and close. Emma and Katie, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us for today's conversation. Take care. Bye-bye.